Hello, everyone, and welcome to Breaking Bad Habits to Improve Your Life. Which is easier, possible or impossible? Making habits is what we do. Practically any species, from the vertebrate family, perhaps with the exception of fish, create new habits all the time. Habits are stored in the part of the brain we share not only with mammals, but also birds and reptiles. The basal ganglia. This is why a habit cannot be broken. It's saved in your brain, forever. Initially, this may sound scary, like you're doomed to fall into bad habits time and time again. But rest assured, this is not the case. Although a habit cannot technically be broken, we can develop an understanding of our habits in order to help us manage our behaviors, regulating the effect these habits have in our everyday lives. What we recognize as breaking old habits is actually one of these two things: eliminating the trigger for the habit and reprogramming the habit. That is, in the simplest terms, what this course is all about. Sorry if I gave you a fright, but we all understand what a habit is in general terms, and yet we still struggle to manage them. In order to truly get a handle on our habits, good and bad alike, it's important that we really understand them on a fundamental level, which may require us to reconceptualize what a habit actually is. Between this introduction and our conclusion, this course will consist of 4 units designed to help you understand how and why you create habits, which habits to break, which habits to keep, and how to know when a habit has gone too far. We'll discuss strategies, tips, and tricks to help you develop the habits you want and break the ones you don't. I'll also walk you through the science of habits and how we can use it to our advantage. As you'll learn, understanding your habits is just the beginning. Really changing your habits, and therefore changing your life, requires daily action. Daily, sustained action brings results. And what is a daily, sustained action? A habit. So to get you started in your journey, the end of each unit will also include an exercise for you to complete, so that you can put into practice what you'll have just learned. I highly recommend getting a notebook or journal specifically for this purpose, and for continued use afterward in your journey toward creating healthier habits. There are a number of possible reasons that may have brought you here. Maybe you want to quit smoking or shake some other bad habit. Maybe you're looking to build new, healthier habits for your own well-being or peace of mind. Or maybe this is a means to the end of taking a step toward your dream life. Either way, habits are the best life change generator at your disposal. Jim Rohn, the successful entrepreneur and motivational speaker, was convinced that true life changes are driven by one's personal philosophy. He perceived his whole life's journey as nothing more than an outcome of his attitudes and beliefs. This belief is a cornerstone of my philosophy too. As a father, husband, author, and database administrator, I know how important it is to develop habits and routines in order to live your best and most effective life. As of 2021, I have written and published 18 books all about habits, perseverance, and time management. I can't resist the urge to help make this world a better place through self-improvement, focusing on my personal growth, and the absolute transparency of my progress. If all of this sounds appealing to you, listen on to dive into our first unit, the science of habits. Let me begin by welcoming you to the course proper, Breaking Bad Habits to Fix Your Life. We've already established just how powerful habits can be. In this unit, we're going to talk about the science behind the power of habits. Have you ever wondered why it's so easy to fall into unhealthy or bad habits? Why it is that you can't stop eating too much junk food or staying up way too late binge watching a new TV show? And why can't good habits be as easy to form? The short answer is that those unhealthy things hack their way directly into our body's reward system. In other words, when we indulge those dangerous, tempting vices, we experience an immediate reward, namely pleasure, from doing them. After that, we crave the pleasure we derive from that activity, so the behavior gets reinforced. It easily becomes a habit. In Charles Duhigg's book, The Power of Habit, Duhigg explains that scientists set out to explore their hypothesis that major life events, getting married, the death of a family member, the birth of your first child, etc., constituted the most significant life-changing factors that ordinary people experience. Instead, over the course of their research, they discovered that behind most individual life changes were even the smallest changes in daily habits. Duhigg attributes their results to what he calls the habit loop mechanism, the phenomenon we just described, which he explains as a neural loop that forms in our brains when we begin to create a habit. You encounter a cue, a stressful situation or person, or really just any sensory impression that elicits an ultimately repeated behavior. This behavior, or habit, is the routine, your response to the cue. And finally, for habits to stick, that behavior typically brings forth some reward, which reinforces the behavior and cements your routine as a habitual neural response to the original cue. These neural impulses are stored in the basal ganglia, the part of the brain we share with other mammals, birds, and reptiles. This indicates that habits are common for even the most primitive life forms. They are fundamental to our existence. Once coded into your brain, the habit loop cannot be removed unless it's physically damaged. The only thing you can do with an existing habit is to reprogram it over time. This fits neatly with what research says about habits and change. Since our habits are forever with us and they work consistently, they generate change. Unhabitual behaviors don't generate changes because they nullify each other. For example, one day you could eat a burger, the next day you could eat a carrot. The overall effect is null. But if you have a habit of eating burgers or carrots, it's a different story. Repeated over time, these small habits are followed by a cascade of changes. It's really the time factor that brings the change in. Habits have the change potential because they employ time. They repeatedly bring a specific factor to work in our lives. So how do we work with our brains instead of against them? We'll explore that in more detail in a later unit, but for now, it serves us to consider how we might consciously take control over that habit loop mechanism. Dr. B.J. Fogg, head of the Behavior Design Lab at Stanford University, researched behavioral change for over 2 decades and concluded that only 3 things will change your behavior in the long term. A. Having an epiphany. B. Changing your environment. And or C. Taking baby steps. In a way, Fogg argues, taking baby steps is essentially what habits are. Behaviors that are repeated over time, slowly in this case. He considers this option to be the most effective way to change one's behavior in the long term. Consciously building new behaviors can be bothersome or frustrating at the very beginning when a habit is new to you. Even just remembering that you're trying can take quite a bit of effort. But it's important that you commit to actually doing it. Remember, baby steps. It's also useful to track your efforts and your progress. Changing your habits is all about mental effort. Beware, though, in the beginning, the reward may not be so big. Maybe it's hardly even noticeable. You certainly won't see results immediately. This probably sounds discouraging, but it's all part of the process. If it weren't, developing good habits would be just as easy as developing the unhealthy ones. You switch your diet or exercise for a week before you can see any improvements to your health. Maybe just small improvements here and there. But you don't want small improvements. You want sweeping change, right? And you don't want it next quarter. You want it yesterday. As you can see, your emotions can work against you. The desire for instant gratification is getting the best of you. While developing unhealthy habits, you experience nothing but pleasure. While developing healthy habits, you may often feel disappointment and frustration. Our friend Dr. B.J. Fogg has something to say about this as well. He introduced a brilliant addition to the recognized process of developing new habits that makes your emotions an ally, not an enemy. He insists that you celebrate your habits. Don't let your emotions fend for themselves. If you want to see success, you must consciously derive a feeling of joy from engaging in your desired behavior, whatever habit you are trying to build, not so much from its results. You create your own immediate feedback loop. Sound familiar? But what does this look like in practice? Whenever you successfully engage in your desired habit, whenever you eat that vegetable, whenever you go for a run, or write out that nice letter of gratitude, make some small gesture to yourself, or say something nice to yourself, like, "Nice job," or "I'm awesome." Really, you just want to say or do anything that works for you and will serve as the reward in your habit loop. If you have any difficulties imagining what these words or gestures could be for you, imagine yourself cheering on your favorite team in the championships. They just scored. What do? Jump in place, roar with joy, This is exactly what you should do to reinforce and encourage your healthy habit to develop. Clean the house and roar with joy. Do 10 push-ups and jump with excitement. Drink a glass of water and pump your fists in triumph. Prepare a meal and tell yourself, well done. Now, it's time for an exercise. Take out your journal and list 3 small, healthy habits that you want to cultivate. And when I say small, I mean small. Some examples could be drinking a glass of water before you leave the house each day, going to bed a half hour earlier, or eating 1 piece of fruit a day. Start with baby steps. Then, attempt to add these habits into your life in the coming days. Every time you perform that habit, do what Dr. Fogg suggests and celebrate. Take note each day of how you're feeling, good or bad. But creating new habits and breaking old ones often requires a little more tracking, time, and effort. So, what can we do in addition to psychological conditioning such as this? Listen on to hear all about it in the next unit. Break it. In the last unit, we discussed the science behind habits. Today, we're going to talk about what it looks like to shake those pesky bad behaviors that might not be so healthy. As we've established, we all have habits, both good and bad. Most of us also all have some healthy habits that we would like to instill in ourselves. So how do we get rid of the bad and hang on to the good while building new, healthier habits? Let's start with breaking the bad to make room for the good by taking a look at 3 effective ways to kick a bad habit. Note that these 3 interconnected suggestions may be viewed as a 3-step process to breaking your bad habit, but each step may be individually useful to you at different points along your journey. First, identify the trigger or triggers for your bad habit. Usually, there is a feeling or circumstance that occurs right before you begin to feel the impulse to engage in your bad habit. Try and pay attention to the context of whatever situation you are in the next time you feel yourself itching to do whatever it is that you do. What triggers your bad habit? What is your cue? These triggers can be any number of external stimuli: a stressful situation at work, or a fight with your significant other, or internal feelings such as boredom, tiredness, feelings of purposelessness, and more. Usually, it'll be some combination of both. An external event will elicit some internal feelings, which elicit your response or routine. To begin getting rid of your bad habit, you need to ultimately eliminate the trigger, but first, you must know what it is. For example, one of my old bad habits was playing too many computer games. I'd played computer games since I was exposed to the computer at the age of 12. I played my whole adult life until I was 33 years old. It was my escape mechanism. I loved strategy games. I could engage my whole brain in the gameplay, and I experienced that sweet pang of dopamine when I won, of course. It was a bad habit, no doubt about that. I didn't play a lot by modern standards, just 24 to 48 hours a month, but I stole those hours from my life. My sleep, my family, my job, all suffered as a result. I even played during work hours sometimes. How hard was it to kick my gaming habit? You might be surprised to hear that it was actually pretty easy. I had what Dr. Fogg would call an epiphany. I decided to change my life. I already knew this habit was not contributing anything good to my life. I had been tracking my time for 2 weeks, every single minute. I played only for 4.5 hours during those 2 weeks. Just the awareness that I would have needed to record my gaming time into my time log was enough to make me back off. After that experiment, I went a little farther. I completely uninstalled the games. So if I got the urge, I'd have to completely install them again, giving me time to rethink. But even this wasn't enough. I had to figure out why I was gaming so much to begin with. I realized that my gaming served as a form of escapism for me. Whenever I felt bored, tired, and most importantly, purposeless, with no meaning in my life, I played as a way to avoid all those restless feelings. Achieving new levels and killing artificial opponents was a substitute for actually achieving something in my life. When I got rid of the trigger, I got rid of the habit. When there was no need for escapism, the habit couldn't arise. By eliminating the trigger from my life and creating space between myself and the habit, uninstalling the games, I was able to easily break myself of this habit. Another effective way to reprogram your bad habits, or the next step in this process, if you will, is to establish boundaries. We are habit sponges. We go through life and pick our habits up on autopilot. This is often how so many of the bad ones sneak their way into our lives. I'm sure you can think of one or two behaviors you repeat while knowing they aren't beneficial to you. I still have a bunch of bad habits I've been, thus far, unable to quench for good. My sweet tooth is a prime example. I can eat sugar in any form and quantity. I can consume a whole cake in one sitting, no problem. This habit is one that I still have trouble with, but I've managed to reduce how frequently I actually engage in it, significantly, by just setting some rules or boundaries about my sugar consumption. Now I very rarely eat sweets. I have specific limits for the sweet things I allow myself to eat. Homemade cakes, honey, and a few other products. Every time I'm around sweets, I am extremely cautious of my consumption decisions so that I don't indulge. So, as you can see, some habits won't necessarily be broken. You may just have to introduce boundaries into your life to prevent yourself from engaging in the bad habit as often. It's all about conscious processing. Make yourself aware of the habit, as we discussed in the first step, and take the time to truly think things through every time the habit comes into your peripheral. This will allow you to disrupt the development of those neural pathways. Finally, let's talk about avoiding the trigger. Like we've mentioned, eliminating your triggers from your life entirely is the ideal strategy. But sometimes, eliminating a trigger from your life entirely is not a possible, or at least feasible, option. Maybe the trigger is something physical that is around in your everyday life or an essential part of your career. Maybe it's a family member. When it occurs, it's best to try and avoid the trigger. For example, I had a really bad habit of reading way too much. I know that sounds crazy, but we'll talk a little bit later about how good habits can become bad ones. In my case, I would skip meals and stay up way too late, just so I could keep reading. It got to the point where it wasn't healthy, but books are something I could constantly run into. I am, after all, a writer. There was no way I could eliminate books from my life entirely. So how did I approach this habit? Well, my particular vice was fiction. Just making that distinction was a start. So I stopped buying fiction books or checking them out from the library. I actually stopped going to the library entirely. If I don't have a book nearby, there's space between the impulse and the habit. Even if I want to read, I can't because there is nothing to read. Even now, if I get a new book, I still devour it as soon as possible, so the habit isn't quite broken. But it isn't constantly interfering with my life anymore, because I do what I can to avoid it, even if I can't afford to remove it from my life altogether. But what about bad habits that are more immaterial? Things like negative self-talk can become habits. That's the impossible difficulty level. You can't fight the opponent you can't even see, especially when you don't even know he exists. The tips I've mentioned may not be as effective for habits that are indulged solely within yourself, the ones that are tied up with your thinking process. So how should we approach bad habits like these? Let's start by focusing on negative self-talk, especially here, as it is often the root of many of our other bad habits. Being rude, alcoholism, swearing, sleep deprivation, being careless with money, a sedentary lifestyle. All of these habits are just symptoms of faulty thinking processes. And behind each of these thinking habits usually lurks the negative self-talk. Maybe you have low self-esteem, so you try to numb it with compulsive shopping or drinking. But where does that low self-esteem come from? This vicious little voice in your head, whispering, "I'm stupid, I'm worthless. My father was cruel to me because he didn't love me. No wonder, I'm downright unlovable, I'm a failure." And most of the time, we don't even notice those whispers. And so, without question, we act as if they are the words of some infallible oracle. Just like with other bad habits, this one has a trigger. Do you remember Marty from Back to the Future? Whenever someone called him a coward, he felt compelled to prove he wasn't. Usually, he ended up in big trouble because of that. It's the same deal with our self-talk. Only it's much more subtle, and therefore dangerous, because it comes from the inside. But the solution to this problem is the same as the solution that worked for Marty. You pause. Turn on your conscious thinking process, examine what's going on, and make a choice about how to react. The choice isn't dictated by your emotions, but by your brain. In order to do this, you need to develop an elusive skill called self-awareness. You must actively work to notice your thoughts sneaking up on you, to successfully repel them, or, at the very least, manage them. Self-awareness gives you so much power. We need to be self-aware to get a handle on our habits, especially negative self-talk. It helps you to notice your thoughts and rationalize away the ones that are unhelpful or harmful, the ones that drive you back into the arms of your bad habit. So yes, sometimes your thoughts and internal dialogue may keep you prisoner. And yes, generally speaking, we are naturally hopeless at noticing and controlling our thought processes. But you can modify those thoughts by attacking the symptoms. When you break the obvious bad habits, the ones that are visible in your life, you become a new person. When you develop new, more positive habits, it affects who you are. And this new version of you has a slightly different thinking pattern, influenced by the change of your circumstances. However, something that we just have to be honest with ourselves about, I deem it an uphill battle. Remember, the strategies we mentioned early all revolve around addressing that root cause of your habits, your triggers. And you can liberate yourself from many of your bad habits if you tackle their common root cause. What is going through your mind? Instead of taking a detour route, you can take the direct one. Disarm your internal demons, and then attack multiple bad habits and create multiple good habits at the same time. All the same, it's good to have as many strategies as possible when it comes to managing your habits, even if some are more effective than others. So develop some self-awareness habits and you will have a fighting chance. You will notice your self-talk, and you will be able to step between the stimulus and reaction. How do we develop self-awareness? Let's walk through a few strategies that may come in handy. Meditating, journaling, taking walks, asking for feedback, and tracking your thoughts and feelings. Meditation is a great activity that can bring you a ton of physical and emotional benefits, practiced even in small doses. Start by just taking 3 deep breaths and focus your mind on that. That's the simplest form of meditation. Of course, meditation works better in larger and more regular doses. It's referred to as a practice, but much of its power lies in the full-out effectiveness of any dose. It will help you to develop mindfulness, a specific type of self-awareness that enables you to observe how you are responding to your environment. Regarding your habits, it will help you to notice when you begin to yearn for your unhealthy habit in response to one trigger or another, so that you can opt to respond in a healthier way. Journaling is also very effective because writing forces you to process your thoughts through the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for abstract thinking. Writing translates emotions and images into words, the language of your conscious mind, enabling you to make better sense of what you're experiencing and respond in a healthier way. I don't quite believe that taking walks is magical in and of itself. It does, however, create space for something that modern people desperately need: reflection, free thinking, a lack of digital distractions, and some physical activity, which pumps blood through your brain. Put all those together, and you have a solid chance to notice your internal voice and do something about it. Asking for feedback is not for the faint of heart. It's about as effective as journaling, and in somewhat similar ways. If you are a people person, it may be even more effective because you pay the utmost attention to social cues, like tone of your voice, facial expressions, and body language. You can ask for feedback even from yourself. I do it all the time with my journaling sessions. Make sure, though, you ask the right questions, and that you're focused on solutions, not asking questions like, "Why am I so hopeless?" Asking for feedback works like journaling. To communicate with another human being, you need to put together a coherent message and process your emotions and internal images via the prefrontal cortex, giving you a chance to process things more rationally. It also helps just to hear the opinion of someone who isn't as set on hurting you as your brain can sometimes be. Finally, we have tracking. Any kind of tracking will do, really, especially if it involves writing. Your mind is a master at playing tricks on you. It says terrible, false things about you, which you end up believing in, despite there being little to no evidence. Tracking is a way to confront your internal voice with reality. Tracking also instills filters in your brain. Track something, anything, and you have much better chances of success than you do by just trying to wing it. So if there's one thing that we've established by this point, it's that, well, yes, it can be very hard to break bad habits. They're imprinted in your brain, and we're so poorly equipped to fight off anything that comes from within. It's especially hard when you have no clue about your own habits or how habits work in general. So you end up trying to attack down the wrong path. You try to mobilize your willpower and kick the bastard. You may succeed once, twice, or even a dozen times, but this is a tireless opponent, and it's set up camp right in your brain. The habit will come back again and again, a dozen times, 100 times. This clash of forces, while maybe our natural response, is not the right tactic. Again, the best tactic is to analyze what triggers the bad habit and put walls and layers between you and this trigger, or between the trigger and the habit, the cue and the routine. Like I did with my gaming habit, try to get rid of the trigger itself. It will freeze the habit in your brain. It will never have a chance to activate itself. And when you can't eliminate it, do your best to avoid it at all costs. The last option we haven't discussed yet is to painstakingly rebuild your habit. Turn it from a bad one into a good one. This one is the master option. Why? Because your new program, likely a much healthier habit, will become the default one. Your old trigger will evoke a new, positive behavior. This is the best way to kick a bad habit for good. But how do you reprogram your habit? I'll be honest with you, it's a long and laborious process. You need to analyze the bad habit, find its triggers, find out what good it is doing to you. Maybe it encourages you to socialize with others, for example. And then design a plan which will use the existing triggers in order to produce the desired end effect. Charles Duhigg explained it best, and even though it's not easy, it is pretty simple. Basically, in response to your trigger, you need to engage in the new behavior about as many times as you engage in the old habit plus one, to make this new routine stronger than the old one. Of course, there are other factors at play. How much attention do you dedicate to your new routine? How mindful you are? How much you invest emotionally into it? How many repetitions can you stuff into a short period of time to get the momentum, etc.? But none of these additional factors change the basic math. Your new neural loop must be stronger than the old one to make a new behavior your new default response to one trigger or another. Remember to focus on the good things in your life and embrace a positive attitude. Changing or breaking a bad habit can be difficult, and we need to remember that this is a positive change for the better. Baby steps don't just count, they are the best way to make it happen. Be patient with yourself. Celebrate when you catch yourself doing the right thing, just like we talked about in the previous section. Now, it's time for our exercise. Take out your journal or notebook and write down a bad habit that you would like to break or change. Identify the trigger and describe it. Next, ask yourself what the best approach to this trigger is. Can you eliminate the trigger? If not, can you avoid it? If you can do neither, is there a boundary you can set up between your cue and your routine to help you stay on track? Spend the next week tracking this habit. Write down whether you engage in the behavior or not, and which tactics are succeeding. Now that we know how to begin dismantling our bad habits, let's talk about instilling good ones in the next unit. Making it. So far, we've talked about the science of habits and how to break free of your bad ones. As much as is possible, anyway. But what about building better habits? We all want to make good choices in our lives for our well-being. We want to be healthy, happy, and effective in the pursuit of our goals. Habits, as I've already said, are essential to generating life change. So how do we create and stick to new habits? That's what we're going to talk about in this unit. When you're forming a new habit, it can be hard to even remember to make sure you are actually engaging in the desired behavior regularly at first. Or maybe it's the motivation that's not easy for you. And it can be hard to convince yourself that you need to do it. Either way, don't fret. I have some concrete strategies that you can use to help yourself stay consistent in practicing your new habit. Some of these might even sound familiar. These strategies include setting reminders for yourself, creating a visual cue, anchoring your habits to each other, and tracking your efforts. Once we've gone through these basic, easy-to-use strategies, I'll share with you my own ace in the hole, writing a personal mission statement. Let's dive in. First, set a reminder for yourself. Like we mentioned, it can be difficult to even remember that you're trying to build a new habit at first, through the clutter of your day-to-day life. All of life's responsibilities won't pause themselves for your personal development. So why not simply set a reminder on your mobile device that will prompt you to engage in the activity? Maybe you can even set a few. This strategy works with habits that happen at a specific time, and is very useful if that is the case. But you can also set reminders at random times for habits that are easy to do anywhere. For example, If your desired behavior is to water your garden before work, you can likely set a reminder 10 minutes before you usually walk out the door. If your desired behavior is less fixed and won't always happen at the same time, set several random reminders throughout the day for arbitrary times to take 3 deep breaths, unclench your jaw, or call your mom. Another good strategy is to find and create visual cues that prompt you to engage in your desired behavior. Visual cues work great when you are working on a habit that you engage in when you are in a specific place. Put the cue in a visible place, and you will be reminded about your desired habits just by looking at it. Ideally, the cue should be connected to the habit. For example, if you want to jog in the morning, prepare your shoes and outfit and put them in front of your bedroom door. If you want to read, put a book on your bedside cabinet. As you go about your day, when you're in this space, you'll be reminded of the habit that you're trying to establish, and you will be more likely to just do it right then and there. Next up, anchor it. This is a fun one. Try using another existing habit as your cue to engage in your desired behavior, anchoring one habit to the other. As you know by now, habits are highly reliable. Remember our friend Dr. B.J. Fogg? Here are some examples from his course, Tiny Habits. After I pour my coffee, I'll text my mom. After I sit down on the train, I will open my sketchbook. After I arrive home, I will hang my keys up by the door. In each of these examples, you are taking existing habits, things as ordinary as drinking coffee or going to and from work, and associating them with the new habits that you're trying to build. Where you find one, you'll find the other. It's important to note here that context is key. Of course, you wouldn't hang up your keys after brushing your teeth, and you wouldn't go for a run while you're on the train to work. Make it easy on yourself. Group your habits as logically as you can to make sure you'll be more likely to actually engage in the behavior. These anchors help us to remember our habits by giving us another activity that we will always perform either way, making it our cue to perform the new habit. Finally, track your efforts. Notice how many different ways that keeping a record of things can make a big difference. Whereas before, we talked about tracking your negative thoughts and feelings, here we mean tracking the habit itself. In my experience, tracking is pure gold in habit creation and is a factor that can make or break the development of your habit. Without tracking, the chances for habit building reduce drastically. So what exactly does habit tracking look like? In its simplest form, you are just recording whether you have done your habit or not. The means you use to record this is absolutely up to you. You may use a pen and paper, an Excel sheet, a text file, an application, a wall calendar, anything. A journal is a great way to do this, and is probably the most often suggested form of habit tracking. It's recommended because it works. Habit tracking is so effective for the same reason that tracking your thoughts is. We tend to let our bad habits run rampant and struggle to build our new ones because failing to do what is necessary is easy to get away with when we're not tracking ourselves. Tracking your habits creates a system of self-accountability you can use to make sure you're taking things seriously. That said, this strategy is about an objective comparison of your goal versus your behavior. Although I recommend celebrating your wins, I would avoid being overly judgmental of yourself when you don't meet your goal. This just generates more negative self-talk, which may lead to the indulgence of other bad habits, or, at the very least, scare you off from the process altogether. Now I want to move on to another strategy for making new habits that I've intentionally separated from the others, because of how powerful this strategy has been in my life. I'd like to recommend creating a personal mission statement. As I've said before, I'm certainly no stranger to the power of bad habits and the difficulty in overcoming them. But here I am. I went through quite an impressive transformation, and I haven't looked back at many of my past bad habits. I credit much of my success in creating better habits for myself and avoiding my past destructive habits to my personal mission statement. First, the act of creating this document made me think deeply about what my priorities, dreams, and goals were for my life. So I didn't only want to change, I documented exactly what I wanted and why. But the creation of the mission statement was only 20% of why it was successful for me. The other 80% was using it every day as a reminder of why I was doing what I was doing, of my vision for my life. This way I could never forget the bigger picture. I could never brainwash myself back to the old state of mind and forget what I was trying to achieve. You don't want to just read your personal mission statement or your goals. It's a good start, but it's definitely not enough to change your life. Those visual cues, or goals, that mission, are just reminders for you to act. Remember, daily action is what will actually manifest the change in your life. Don't just look at your goals and do nothing to attract what you deserve. Ideally, your cues should become triggers for your new habits. For example, you look at your goals in the bathroom mirror and start repeating affirmations. You look at a sheet of paper with your mission lying on your desk, and you immediately get to work, avoiding the tempting abyss that is social media. The feeling of satisfaction and pride you get from rising to the occasion will serve as the reward that will help you establish this routine as a habit. We all have our own personal philosophies, and this personal mission statement is an extension of those philosophies. You have your own set of rules, which tell you how to approach change, how to develop good habits, and what to do when you feel sad or tired. And many people have little clue what those rules are in their own lives. They are often subconscious, below the level of attention of your conscious mind. Your personal philosophy has been shaped by your whole life experience, so it's not easy to modify. But what are life experiences? They are whatever has happened to you over time and how you interpreted those events. So, at the most basic level, they are your input sources, whatever came through your senses, and how you responded to those sensory impulses. Here's where it gets good. You can re-engineer your personal philosophy by making conscious choices about your input sources and your internal interpretation of events. The first part is easy. Take an inventory of how you would like to change, and then look for media outlets, blogs, books, YouTube channels, and podcasts that will support your new personal philosophy. Create relevant consumer habits around those new sources. Read 10 pages a day, watch one TED Talk a day, listen to one podcast episode a day, and so on. The written documentation of this reconsideration, or maybe your first real consideration, of your personal philosophy is what will ultimately become your personal statement. Sitting with your internal interpretation of your experience is trickier. Most people don't discern their internal voice from their own self. It's me who says those things in my head, isn't it? Thus, the internal voice and your responses to it are so automatic that you don't even notice them. We touched on some of this earlier, but it's important to consider in this new context. To shift your internal perspective, you need mindfulness and self-awareness. Hence, the habits I recommend are meditation, prayer, journaling, and spending time in silence with your own thoughts. Many of the ones I mentioned in the previous unit. Always remember that you cannot put yourself together on your own. A good friend of mine, who's unhoused, told me that, and I've never forgotten it. We are social animals. We are wired for cooperation. Take someone, anyone, on board. Your chances of seeing lasting change in your life will skyrocket. It can be anybody, your spouse, sibling, friend, mentor, or coach. Bounce ideas off them, get their feedback. Let them advise you, or just encourage or console you. Heavy stuff, right? Let's take a step back and consider an example of what some of these strategies look like in practice. One of my favorite examples revolves around daily money habits. These are usually some of the first good habits that people want to instill in their everyday lives. The overwhelming majority of people who struggle financially have no good money habits, and some bad ones on top of that. They succumb to whichever buying impulses attack them. They take loans when they shouldn't, common consumer debts. They don't pay taxes and bills on time. The list just goes on. But by using the strategies we've talked about today, you can instill good money habits and drastically improve your financial situation. Tracking is huge for this one. Track the habit, such as putting a certain amount of your paycheck in savings every payday. Are you saving according to your goals? This tracking strategy can also be applied more generally to tracking your income and expenses as well. I recommend using a pen and paper to do this. It makes you a lot more aware of your budget. Setting a reminder would work really well for this as well. Set a reminder every payday to remind you to pay yourself first. Or maybe set random reminders throughout the month to transfer just $5 to your savings account. You can have fun here to develop some strategies that work for you and your life. Never buy on impulse. Do you remember how we talked about triggers in the previous unit? Well, that certainly applies here. Figure out the trigger for your impulsive spending and do your best to eliminate or avoid it. You can definitely use visual cues or an anchor to help yourself develop your new habit of saving instead of spending too. These will also likely be unique to you and your life. So keep an eye out for creative ways in which you can make them work for you. There are many other things I recommend specifically for financial habits, such as avoiding debt, buying secondhand, and paying with cash. However, I do want to remind you that it is almost always a good idea to invest in yourself. By this, I mean taking a class that can help you advance in your career, buying educational books, or making a small trip to talk to a really successful person in your career field. These things will usually make you money in the long run. The important distinction is that these investments aren't, or at least shouldn't be, impulse buys. They're intentional decisions you've made to improve the quality of your life. Your personal statement and support system, as always, will also be incredibly helpful in developing and cementing a habit such as this. If your mission statement includes the life you're trying to build, and specifically, how saving money will help you get there, you'll always be conscious of, and therefore driven, by your reason for saving. It's always important to remember why you're doing what you're doing, and get help when you need it. It's time to put all this into practice in the form of an exercise. Take out your journal or notebook and write down 1. A first draft of your personal mission statement, and 2. 1 or 2 good habits that you want to start building. Identify which of the strategies we learned about can best help you to begin instilling this habit in an easier fashion. Write down exactly how you will use this strategy to instill the habit. Next, identify how the habit fits in with your personal mission statement. Can you use anything from your mission statement to help you instill this habit? Track it. For a week, make sure to take note every day of your progress. Did you engage in the behavior? Is your strategy working? If not, why? What else could you try? The more specific you are at each stage of the exercise, the better. That's all for now. We have one more unit before we reach the end of this course. I call it Know When Enough is Enough. And it's about making sure our habits, even our good ones, don't turn destructive. When you're ready, listen on. We're getting there, my friends. So far, we've covered the science of habits, breaking habits, and making habits. Today, let's talk about where things get tricky. We are all very aware by now that some habits are good in our lives, and some are bad. Of course we are. But look out. Sometimes, it's easy to forget that any habits, good or bad, can quickly spiral out of our control and turn into addictions, or at least, cause legitimate problems in our lives. So in our last full unit together, I want to talk about finding and drawing that line. Research indicates that there are definite correlations between dopamine, addiction, and habits. We still know very little about these correlations, but we are sure of their existence. Dopamine-inducing substances and habits are, first of all, addicting. Dopamine equals pleasure, and without proper regulation, pleasure can lead to addiction or dependence. And an addiction can equal death. Maybe not always a physical death, but surely the death of the full human experience. Take, for example, our cell phones or mobile devices. Using your mobile device is one of the most dopamine-inducing behaviors in our society. Each touch gives you a little dose of dopamine because it is not only released when you feel pleasure, but also shoots when you anticipate it. All of those notifications are exactly that, the anticipation of pleasure standing in for the pleasure itself. And when it's good news, you're looking at a double dose. The trouble with excessive phone use and similar behaviors is that it always spirals downward. After some time, your familiar dose of whatever it is feeding you your dopamine acts as less of a stimulus, so you increase the dose. Some more time passes, and once again, it stops being as stimulating. You increase and increase the dose until your whole life revolves around the pursuit of more, and you are no longer a full human being. There will never be enough for you, because as you adapt to your growing need, the need keeps growing. A lack of moderation can easily end up as an addiction. Moderation is always the best route. Thus, I'm inclined to believe the research, which associates an excess of dopamine with becoming hyperactive and manic, and developing troubles with concentration. The more you flood your system with dopamine, the less you are a creature of reflection, and more a creature of impulses. So the interesting implication here is that even good habits can turn into addictions. Let's have a look at the definition of the word habit. A habit is a settled or regular tendency or practice, especially one that is hard to give up. That doesn't sound too far off from addiction, does it? When your habit becomes compulsive, you've got trouble. This is why moderation is so important. Personally, I went through much of this in my own life, most notably with my habit of reading fiction that I have mentioned previously. Normally, we think of reading as a good habit. It might even be one you wish to instill. It's one we definitely do our best to instill in our children, right? But my reading addiction is a great example of how even the healthiest of habits can turn destructive if we let them go too far. Another good example of how good habits can turn into addictions is definitely healthy eating. It's obviously fantastic to want to eat more fruits and veggies. But if you begin restricting your food intake to an alarming degree or counting your calories obsessively, you may want to scale back. Failing to properly moderate this seemingly good habit can turn into a full-blown eating disorder. If any habit, good or bad, begins to prevent you from living your life healthily, such as preventing you from eating or sleeping a healthy amount, then it is quickly turning from a habit to an addiction. There is no shame in accepting or admitting when a habit has accidentally become an addiction. Try to avoid judging yourself when considering whether this is happening in your life. As we said before, this tendency may just lead us back to other nasty habits. It's just important to know the warning signs, and don't be afraid to ask for help if you need it. So let's do a thought exercise. Take out your journal or notebook and write down a good habit that you have or want to instill. Write down some thoughts on how that habit could become unhealthy. What would the warning signs be? How would you know it was becoming a problem? Brainstorm some actions you could take to make sure that you don't go overboard. Say you want to read more, as I mentioned earlier. Maybe you make sure to set a timer for a half hour each time you sit down to read so that you don't neglect other responsibilities. When tracking this habit, write down any changes you notice in yourself during or after the activity. Brainstorm what you need to do to make sure it stays a healthy habit in case you ever notice some addiction-indicating behaviors arising. Ask for feedback from someone you trust about your addiction warning signs, so they can be an outside eye if needed. We're almost done with this course. Before I leave you, I'd like to share some concluding thoughts and summarize what we've learned here during this course, leaving you with some resources that can help you along your journey after we've wrapped up. Listen on for the conclusion of our time together. This is it. Congratulations on finishing this course. Break bad habits and improve your life. So few ordinary people realize just how powerful a role our small daily habits play in the dictation of our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors in the unfolding of our lives. We're far more likely to attribute the quality of our lives to major life events, the moments according to which we define ourselves. Of course, these experiences do have a powerful effect on us. For example, many of these kinds of life-changing events can lead to the kinds of epiphanies and changes in our environment that Dr. B.J. Fogg says will ultimately change our behavior in the long term. But when we look closely, it isn't long before we realize that these events are not the driving force behind how we actually change. It's our habits. It's that neural habit looping mechanism. But before I get ahead of myself, let's quickly go over what we learned here before we conclude. First, we talked about the science of habits and how we can use it to our benefit. We encounter a cue, an external or internal stimulus or trigger. This cue prompts a neural response, which makes itself known by way of a specific routine, a behavior, or habit. Finally, we experience a reward, a positive feeling, or something that satisfies the initial impulse. That reinforces the behavior as a response to the stimulus until it becomes habitual. If we allow this process to go unregulated, we become slaves to our impulses and susceptible to the development of bad habits. If we become aware of this process, however, and take daily actions to intermediate the development of our habits, we are able to ensure that we are only allowing positive, healthy habits to develop. Among other things, we also discussed how celebrating your habits can help you to more easily retain them. Then we zoomed in more specifically on how to break bad habits. We looked at multiple strategies that we could use to break ourselves of bad habits, such as identifying, avoiding, and eliminating your triggers, and setting up boundaries between your triggers and your behavior, and how being self-aware and cultivating a more positive attitude can help. Some strategies for developing self-awareness and overcoming negative self-talk included meditating, journaling, taking walks, asking for feedback, and tracking your thoughts and feelings. Next, we discussed building good habits. I told you about 4 strategies that you can use to help you form and keep your new positive habits. Setting reminders for yourself, creating and finding visual cues, anchoring your habits to each other, and tracking your efforts, as well as how creating a personal mission statement can help you to develop healthy habits and remind you why you set out to build them in the first place. Finally, I explained how even good habits can become harmful through addiction or obsession. We explored that tricky line at which a habit becomes an addiction, and how to monitor your behaviors so your healthy habits stay healthy. Thank you so much for listening to this course. If you enjoyed our time together and want to find me or more of my work, please go to my website, expandbeyondyourself.com, where you can find my blog, a list of my books, and more. My books are all sold on Amazon if you would like to purchase one. Before we wrap for good, I'd like to walk you through a list of additional resources that you can use to continue on in your journey to master your habits, some of which we have referenced throughout the duration of this course. First, I'd like to recommend one of my own books, From Shy to High, which focuses specifically on some of the bad habits we develop as a way to cope with anxiety specifically. Although many of the principles outlined in the book are similar to what we've discussed here, I have found in my personal experience that it's better to develop new habits than focus on breaking bad habits when it comes to social anxiety. And so this book is specifically recommended for those of you who struggle with anxiety. We've talked a little bit about this next one. In Charles Duhigg's book, How Habits Work, he focuses on the science of habits. He emphasizes that habits are unbreakable and hard-coded in your brain. The only thing you can do with them is to reprogram them. Another shortcut is to avoid the trigger for a bad habit. It works almost as well. No trigger equals no bad behavior triggered. You just need to remember that the bad habit is still saved in your brain. So you need to be mindful of avoiding the trigger for the rest of your life. I know. We've already talked about this. But How Habits Work is the best piece about reprogramming habits available on the internet. And so it's worth hearing it straight from the horse's mouth, as it were. I also recommend Atomic Habits by James Clear. It contains a neat framework, which helps with both developing good habits and avoiding and/or eliminating the bad ones. He recommends several binary frameworks for how to approach good and bad habits. For example, we want to make good habits obvious and bad habits invisible, good habits attractive and bad habits unattractive. Make good habits easy and bad habits difficult. Make good habits satisfying and bad habits unsatisfying. Get the point? You'll get it even more once you read the book, which I recommend especially for its straightforward organization of these concepts. Dr. B.J. Fogg's model brilliantly demonstrates how to change our behaviors. It goes hand in hand with the Atomic Habits framework. Dr. Fogg also has a great book that we have mentioned here, Tiny Habits. But it is focused on developing new behaviors, not eliminating old ones. So if you are interested strictly in breaking habits, just read whatever is in his free content that you can find on the net. However, in my opinion, saturating your life with a swarm of small, new habits is one of the best tactics to quit your bad habits. In addition to the several resources at your disposal for you to use over the course of your journey, there's something else that you can keep with you and use after our time together that you may not have considered: your journal. If you bought a brand new notebook for the purpose of the exercises that you completed throughout the course, you may have noticed that it's hardly been filled. What now? Well, you can continue to use this notebook as a way to track your thoughts and feelings and track your habits, like we discussed. You can also use it to repeat the exercises every now and then. Here's a fun idea. It's time to get meta. Periodically checking in on your progress can, in and of itself, become a positive habit in your life. You heard that right. Make a habit of being intentional in the development and management of your habits. This is a sure way to make sure you're staying focused and doing what you need to do in order to take control of your life. Alas, all good things must come to an end. If you feel ready to embark on the process of fixing your life, then go forth. I wish you well. If you're feeling a little overwhelmed, like you've just been ambushed by an army of life-changing information, then I'll leave you with a final thought to consider. Fortunately, it's one I already mentioned long ago. At least it feels that way. Remember Jim Rohn? In our introductory unit, I explained that he perceives his whole life's journey as nothing more than an outcome of his attitudes and beliefs. How badly do you want to change? Do you believe you're capable of it? Good. At the end of the day, this is the most important thing. In this course, we've covered the how, but only you can determine the why, and perhaps most importantly, the will. When you do, the action will follow. Find it in yourself to resolve that you will do what you must to achieve the life you want. Once you've found that resolve, all it takes is the first step. And guess what? By listening to this course, you've already taken it. Isn't that nice? Go back through this course as many times as you need to. Use your journal to sift through it and extract the most actionable steps that you can begin taking to kickstart your journey. Which strategies seemed the most appealing to you? Or, just as important, which ones felt the most accessible to you or applicable to your life? Remember, baby steps. Take some time to figure out how you can best use what you've learned in a way that works for you. Then, write it down and get started. You can do it. In fact, anyone can. That's all I've got.